Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Basis Technologies webinar in our ongoing series of webinars about all things DevOps and automation in the world of SAP. As you can see on the screen here today, we're going to be discussing 10 steps to help you get started with DevOps for SAP. But first, a bit of webinar admin before we begin. As always, today's session is being recorded, and we will be sending a link to the recording to all who registered. If for any reason you do not receive the link via email in the next day or two, please check your spam folder, and if it's not there, feel free to get in touch with us via our website, or there will be some contact details at the end of this session. You can always reach out, and we will get the recording link to you as soon as possible. And as always, all participants are on mute, and we would like to encourage you to enter any questions you may have into the question box in your control panel, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session. We're going to aim to run for about 35 to 40 minutes today, but this is a high-level overview of this topic, and if at any point you want to get into more details that we don't cover today, do please get in touch with us. We would welcome the opportunity to talk to you and answer any additional questions. So without further ado, let's move to introductions. Our speaker today is James Barter, Solution Director at Basis Technologies, and he is based in our London office. James is an expert in all things DevOps for SAP and has spent over a decade helping some of the world's biggest SAP users make their businesses more agile and competitive by employing DevOps automation. James, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Jessica. So yes, as Jessica said, my name's James Barter. I'm the DevOps Solution Director here at Basis Technologies. And today we're going to be looking at, essentially we're going to be moving sort of from the theoretical, if you like, to the practical by looking at 10 tangible actions that you can take to get you started on your, excuse me, on your DevOps journey. And obviously, we'll be going through these steps at a very high level, as Jessica said, because as you can imagine, we could probably spend, I don't know, an hour on each one of these if we were really looking at them in detail. So this is really all about just trying to give you an idea of where to start and what to be looking at in some of these areas and stuff you need to think about when you start your DevOps journey. And I will be using that phrase quite a lot during this webinar because it really is a journey, and we'll talk about that a bit more later in the presentation. We're also going to take a look at why automation and tooling are so important when we're talking about DevOps for SAP. And then we'll take a quick look at how DevOps automation is already delivering for many SAP businesses and some of the quantifiable benefits that it's bringing to those organizations. As Jessica said, I'm sort of aiming for around 30 minutes of presentation, and hopefully we'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end for some Q&A. So if you do have any questions as I run through this, and I expect you will, please just put them into the GoToWebinar Q&A box. So let's just start off at the beginning. I mean, why do we need to do anything? We've been delivering SAP change in the same way for years. So what's different now? Well, I think we'll all agree that the way we've been working in the past with our sort of big monolithic projects that can take many months to even sort of start delivering business value. And of course, it is business value after all that we're talking about here. And that sort of monolithic many-month project is really no longer sort of seen as acceptable to the business. The world is moving at a faster and faster pace, and our businesses need to keep up with those changes to evolve and survive. It might be that our business just wants to deliver some innovation and disrupt our marketplace. It might be us needing to respond to something a competitor is doing, or it might be more sort of technical areas. We need to upgrade or move to the cloud or transition to S/4HANA. Or even things like business reorganizations by acquisitions or divestitures, whatever it may be. But whatever the reason for making changes, enterprise applications like SAP need to evolve and deliver value frequently to respond to these sort of ever increasing business needs. And this is where DevOps comes into play. So, what is it? What is DevOps? DevOps and Agile are really a set of principles and even some processes that were developed to make IT more responsive to business needs. Yeah? But it's not all just about moving faster. It's also about delivering higher quality to the business, because after all, there's no point in delivering much faster if all we're doing is really causing more problems for the business by putting poor quality changes into our production systems. And it uses collaboration and underlying automation technology to reduce risk, pick up potential issues as early as possible in the development cycle, and all of this so we can improve the efficiency and improve productivity, and as I say, deliver that value to the business as early as possible. And all of this is underpinned by what we call a set of continuous processes. So continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, continuous testing, and last but not least, continuous improvement. But you could say to yourself, well, why bother? As I say, we've been doing things in a different way for many years. But if you look at the statistics for organizations that have deployed these kinds of techniques, the results are really quite impressive. So here's a snapshot from last year's DORA State of the DevOps report. And you can see some of those impressive statistics, sitting there in black and white. Well, okay, color actually, but I'm going to let those sort of numbers speak for themselves. But you can see how organizations that have implemented these types of processes compare to ones that haven't. And I think, as you're sort of digesting those numbers on the screen, it does sort of remind me of one of our customers that I spoke to a while ago, who, by the way, have moved to daily releases into their SAP production systems. And one of the things they told me was very interesting, because they said before implementing Agile and DevOps processes, excuse me, the average amount of time it took for them to get from concept, i.e. someone had a great idea, to value, i.e. that good idea was actually in an SAP production system and delivering value, was around about 18 months on average. But after transforming to these types of processes, that concept to value time came down to, on average, about 3 weeks, say from 18 months to 3 weeks. So you can see, just by, I suppose by that little anecdote, if nothing else, the power and the benefits that can be accrued by using these types of processes in our development and deployment areas. So let's get into the meat of the presentation. Now we've sort of seen why it's worth doing this and worth moving to these newer ways of working. So let's now look at the sort of 10 tangible steps that you can take to get you started on that DevOps journey. So firstly, and this might surprise you, we need to define what DevOps really means for your business or for my business. Because interestingly, if you look at the Agile manifesto, it's based on a number of principles. It doesn't actually specify specific processes, because these may well be different from organization to organization. And of course, there are a number of different ways and different approaches to actually doing Agile development. Probably the two most commonly used, and you've probably heard of, are Scrum and Kanban. But there are others like Scaled Agile and these types of things as well. So it's important to map out a vision and a roadmap on how we're going to get to that vision. And of course, it might be that other areas of your organization have already adopted DevOps ways of working. After all, they're widely used outside of the SAP arena. So look at what they're doing. So what are they doing? How are they doing it? How might their processes have to be adapted for a specific architecture and ways of working in SAP? And last but not least, it's important to realise that this whole thing is going to require a cultural change across all of the teams involved. So it won't happen overnight. Like I mentioned earlier, it will be a journey and it will take you time to realise your goals and objectives. But your vision and roadmap will ensure you stay on the right path as you're moving through this journey. So we've got our vision and our roadmap. We now need to look at bringing the right people with us. And the reason we need to do this is because these types of initiatives often start with just a small group of developers or someone who get together and say to themselves, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And they start investigating these things and start coming up with great ideas. So they can start doing some things, but at some point they're going to reach like a glass ceiling because they're not going to be able to get the buy-in from teams, and they won't be able to get the required organizational changes done to sort of really make this happen. So it is important that there is leadership support from the start of your journey. After all, this is eventually going to touch the entire SAP organization. So we do need that leadership support. And as we're doing that, we also want to try and get some buy-in from the teams that are going to be affected because of the organizational change, which we will get into in a few more minutes, that's going to be required when you move to DevOps and agile processes. Their roles are going to change and evolve. They're going to, as they sort of move into more collaborative, sort of business outcome centered organizations. Yeah. So we need to ensure that there's adequate support and training for those individuals as they transition into those new ways of working. Yeah. So we've defined what DevOps means to us at our organization. We've got our vision and our roadmap. Hopefully we've got our leadership support. So what's next? Yeah, unfortunately, the dreaded business case. We will need to put together a solid business case so that we also have the buy-in of the business. Yeah. And to do this, we really just need to show, what does it cost us today? So we can examine historical data if we have it, how much has sort of delayed or failed projects cost us in the past. How much, for example, does a P1 in production cost us? What about the cost of just general inefficiency, multiple reworks of code into QA systems? At the end of the day, we all know the famous IBM study. If an issue is found in development and fixed, it costs 1. If it's found and fixed in QA, it costs 10. And if it's found and fixed in production, it costs 100. So, we need to look at what those costs are today. But we could also look at what some people would probably call sort of the opportunity cost of not doing it. Because if we can deliver value and innovation to the business faster, and we have less issues because we've increased the quality of what we're delivering, what might that mean to increased revenue for the business? So you might be sitting there listening to me thinking, what on earth are we going to get, or where on earth are we going to get this information from? Well, if you don't have that historical data and it's not easy to come by, then you can just use estimates. And in fact, you'd be really surprised how even conservative estimates of some of these things can allow you to build a solid business case. For example, I had one of our customers I was talking to about this exact same thing. And when they were looking at building their business case, they just estimated that a P1 in production cost them about $100,000 on average. Obviously, some of them are much bigger, some of them much smaller. But they said on average, we reckon it costs us about $100,000. And then about a year later, they actually went back through and looked in far more detail about how much a P1 in production really cost them. And once they crunched the numbers, it came back as more like an average of $1 million per P1. right? So as I say, even conservative estimates can be compelling. So, we've got our approved business case. We need to actually get on and we need to start doing something. And the first thing we want to do is go agile, okay? So I mentioned agile methodologies earlier, and obviously they can be different. But one of the common themes is to obviously break down our requirements into much smaller chunks of work. Yeah, normally they're called user stories. These user stories are then put into a backlog and prioritized. And this is where a product owner is essential, because not only can a subject matter expert from the business ensure the right user stories are prioritized, depending on what's important to the business at any particular point in time, but they also understand the high-level dependencies. So, these are sort of dependencies I'm thinking about from a business perspective between, between and across business processes, so that they can organize that backlog in a logical way from a business perspective. And so the idea of agile is to deliver these small user stories, put them together. In this slide it says reduce the batch size. In most agile methodologies, we have the idea of what we call sprints, so maybe 2 or 3 week development cycles. And the idea of those 2 or 3 week development cycles is to take those user stories that we've selected for that development cycle or that sprint, and at the end of that sprint have code that is ready and tested and ready for deployment. Now, notice I said ready for deployment, because although at the end of the development cycle we want code that is fully tested and ready to be deployed, we don't have to deploy it if we don't want to for some reason. For example, there may be some other user stories that these user stories have a dependency with, which have been prioritized for the next sprint, and therefore we might want to hold these back and not actually deploy them. But of course, the whole idea of this approach of short cycles of development is that it means that if we need to, we can reprioritize those user stories, and the business can pivot very quickly if it needs to, if the business priorities change. And in that way, we always know that we're delivering maximum business value, if you like, at any time. And of course, because we are delivering these small batch sizes or sprints or whatever you want to call them into production, instead of a 5 or 6 month monolithic project where the business only starts to see value right at the end of the process, we're going to start delivering small amounts of value to them very quickly and over a period of time. Yeah. So this is some of the advantages of using agile development. So we want to go agile, but where do we start, basically? So most organizations start small. Pick one team or a project. Some of our customers have said they're going to start maybe with fixes and defects, and so sort of get the process ironed out, and then start tackling sort of bigger feature enhancements and projects and things like that afterwards. And as I've mentioned several times, this is a journey. So you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to learn, and you're going to evolve, and you're going to get better as you go through each development cycle and as you go through this process. So, and as part of going through this process, it's important that you gather the metrics and KPIs to be able to see, where you're doing well and give ourselves a pat on the back, but also, where there's room for improvement. Where is there still waste or inefficiency in the process? Because this is all about continuous improvement, which is obviously one of the tenets of the DevOps processes. We'll talk a little bit more about metrics and KPIs a little bit later in the webinar as well. But not only that, because talking of metrics and KPIs, it's not just a matter of using metrics and KPIs to improve our processes. Having these metrics and KPIs will give us the sort of empirical evidence, if you like, of how much better it is working this way than the way we used to work. So that's going to help convince not just the business that what we're doing is a great idea, but it's also going to help convince our our colleagues and co-workers in the wider community that might not be quite so au fait with these ideas of agile and DevOps and not really understand some of the benefits that it can bring. Yeah. So we need to have the right metrics. We want to start small. We want to evolve, and we're going to need the support of our co-workers and our wider community and colleagues, because all of this requires us to reorganize our teams around business outcomes. Okay, so we need to move away from our traditional silos where we might have a requirements team which writes the requirements and then throws them over the fence to the development team which develops them and throws them over the fence to the QA team who test them and throw them over the fence to the basis team which then has to deploy them and run them. Yeah. So we need to move to teams of people that are focused on a set of business outcomes with those embedded owners, that product owner that I was talking about before. And they need to work collaboratively to deliver those business outcomes. So we're going to need things like daily communication between all of the people involved. And we want to do that on a daily basis because we want to be able to remove any blockers, ensure people have transparency and visibility of what's going on. And of course, this isn't an easy thing to achieve. Yeah? So, I mean, organizational change management never is, yeah? But it is essential if we want to deliver the best value to the business, which is why I mentioned earlier on one of the slides, I talked on the slide anyway, it talks about creating ambassadors. Yeah, so as our small teams start working in this way, as those people then move out into other teams in the organization, they can become ambassadors for this new way of working, and so we can show the organization that this is better and will produce much better business outcomes. Yeah. So we talked about embedding the business and development and QA teams together, but from a SAP perspective, we also need to ensure that other teams like the security team and the basis team are also involved from the very beginning, because they're the people that are going to have to run this stuff and have an input into how it should be designed and developed. So we need these sort of cross-functional teams essentially. And we also need to be looking at shifting as much of the checking, if you like, as far left in the process as possible. So we pick up potential issues as early as possible. So we need to be identifying risks and impacts and this type of thing as early as possible, so that our cross-functional teams can work together and solve them as they arrive. And we can also do lots of simple things like enforce peer reviews and enforce development standards so that we get higher quality out of the development teams. And of course, we can build in test automation where it makes sense. Yeah. But things most of all, we sort of need these cross-functional teams to feel a collective sense of responsibility and ownership, so we to deliver the required business outcomes and therefore business value. And in fact, it's quite a well-known thing that organizations that have adopted these ways of working, the team members in them often report higher job satisfaction ratings. And I think that's because of the sort of additional responsibility they take, and this sort of empowers them, and they feel a lot more ownership over the outcome, and hopefully over the successful outcome. Yeah. But of course, it's sort of easy for me to sit here and talk about things like, we need to understand risks, we need to understand impacts, we need to bring up the quality of what we're delivering. But of course, in sort of complex environments like SAP, these things are particularly difficult to actually, sort of actually do, if you like. So our 8th step in getting started with DevOps sort of addresses that elephant in the room. Yeah. And it's really all around automation, because it's very difficult to start moving and delivering faster in complex SAP environments without automating as much of the end-to-end process as we possibly can. And because of, I suppose, the very integrated nature of SAP, trying to work out things like, what is the actual impact of a particular change? What are the dependencies between changes and these types of things? Trying to do that manually is just too time-consuming and onerous, especially since what we really want to do is be moving faster. So we need to ensure processes like quality, risk, and impact checks are embedded into our process and automated, so we know for a start that they have happened and they have been done. Yeah. And so, for instance, when a developer says, I've completed my development work, we know that all of those checks, automated checks, have actually been done, so we know that we're getting that quality out. Then, of course, we need to do things like automating the import of transports and the sequencing of transports. We need to understand and manage the dependencies between different user stories. I mean, earlier I mentioned the sort of high-level dependencies that the product owner might identify at the beginning of the process. Dependencies between business processes and stuff like that. But when I'm talking about dependencies here, I'm really talking about sort of the very low-level technical dependencies that can easily happen in SAP environments. Obviously, as a developer, I can write some code which is dependent on anything else in that development system. And as soon as I do that, I obviously then create a dependency between those two sets of development. So we need to understand what those dependencies are. So when we do deploy these changes, we don't get failures. And of course, when we do that deployment, we need to orchestrate those deployments, because this isn't just about putting transports into systems in the right sequence and understanding the dependencies between them. We may have cross-system dependencies across our different SAP applications. We may have manual activities that need to be performed as part of a deployment. So we need to make sure we orchestrate those deployments across and around our SAP landscape. And of course, we also need to ensure that we have the right environments available at the right time with the right code base in them, so that we can facilitate all of the required testing. And all of this, requires we have a process which is as automated as possible. So if we want to automate this sort of end-to-end process, we really need to then also consider what tooling we want to use to facilitate this automation. So I think the first thing to say here is that no one tool will be able to do everything you need. So what we see is our customers are looking at putting sort of a best of breed tool chain in place, if you like. But the one thing you need to remember if you're going to do that is you have to make sure that that tool chain is integrated from the beginning, because you don't just need the automation functions that those tools might provide. You also need full visibility across that tool chain and essentially one version of the truth, no matter which tool you're looking at. So there are some great, let's say, generic tools available, generic backlog management tools, things like maybe Jira or Azure DevOps, maybe even ITSM tools like ServiceNow, etc., have their place. But also you're going to need to look at SAP specific tooling, because some of the generic tools out there just won't work, with the unique architecture of SAP. So think about your tool chain, ensure that it's fully integrated across the whole requirement to deploy process. So we've gone through most of these now. We've understood what DevOps is we've got our vision, we've got our roadmap. We know our organization has to change to become more collaborative and have cross-functional teams. We know we need to use things like agile development and tooling to help automate the end-to-end process. The only remaining piece of the puzzle is I'm just going to go back to essentially something that I said earlier. And it's all about the KPIs and metrics, because we need to make sure we gather the right KPIs and metrics to be able to demonstrate, as I said earlier, with empirical evidence, the value we're delivering to the business. Yeah. So we need to identify all those, track them and be able to show that value with dashboards or review meetings to the business, whatever it may be. And as I mentioned earlier as well, this information is great for showing the business what value we're delivering, but it's just as useful for us sort of internally from an IT perspective, because it also, will show the rest of the team how well we're doing and allow us to continually improve our processes. So there you are. Those are our 10 tangible ways to help your SAP teams move to DevOps ways of working. So I know they were at obviously a very high level, and I went through them all pretty quickly, but I do hope you found that useful, and I hope that makes you, it gets you just starting to think about some of the areas that you're going to need to think about as you move on that journey. So you may be thinking, who are Basics Technologies and where can we help in all of this? So essentially, we've been producing SAP automation tooling for over 25 years that changes the way our customers run their SAP systems. And specifically, we provide the most complete DevOps and test automation platform specifically engineered for SAP. And it's this platform that can help automate your sort of end-to-end requirement to deploy processes. So it can automatically identify the risks, automatically identify impacts, automatically identify dependencies. And of course, while doing this, we're also going to be orchestrating and automating deployments across the SAP landscape and even with non-SAP landscapes as well. Yeah. And of course, this platform can integrate with other tooling that you might be using so that you have the full visibility across that end-to-end process. And as you can see here on the screen, just a small selection of some of the organizations which we've helped move to much more agile and DevOps ways of working. And, not unsurprisingly, our customers see similar benefits from implementing a DevOps approach in SAP, as we saw in the DORA report earlier in the webinar. Yeah? So, our customers typically achieve these kinds of benefits. So, much more automation, so much less manual effort required, much faster delivery of change into their SAP production systems, less risk and a huge reduction in unplanned system downtime because of all the automated analysis which goes on throughout the development and deployment cycle. And of course, this just leads to a lower cost of change overall. Yeah? So in summary, we know that our SAP systems need to respond faster than ever before to business needs. And we've seen that DevOps ways of working can help us achieve this by allowing us to move at speed, but also improve the quality at the same time, which of course reduces the risk. Yeah? But automation tooling is absolutely essential to enable and support that end-to-end process. And lastly, I know I've said it before, but remember, this is a journey. It will take time to evolve the processes that best work for you, and your organization. But I hope you can see with some of those sort of tangible benefits we've seen that organisations get, that you think it's going to be worth starting on that journey. So that's all from me. I hope you found some of that interesting. Of course, if you want any further information, my contact details are on the screen, or you can, of course, visit our website, which obviously has a lot of information and resources to help you, whether you're only just thinking about starting that journey, or you're some way along it. There's probably something there for everyone. So I think we've still got a few minutes to be able to answer some questions. Let me just see what questions we have. If you haven't entered your questions in the Q&A box yet, please do so right now. So the first question is, what are the tools you're actually talking about from Basis Technologies? That was a bit of a remiss of me. I probably should have actually named them. So our DevOps platform, DevOps and testing platform, consists of two main pillars. One is called Active Control, and that is all around the change and release and transport management, and essentially giving SAP customers that ability to deliver continuously but safely into their SAP production systems. The other pillar of that DevOps platform is a tool called Testimony, and Testimony is all around fully automated regression testing of SAP systems, and it uses some very revolutionary, groundbreaking technology called robotic test automation to allow us to fully automate a regression test without having to do things like create test scripts and that type of thing. So once again, if any of that piqued your interest, please go onto our website, have a read, and get in contact if you want more information. I got another question here. Does the product handle both ABAP and Fiori transports, PO as well? And it absolutely is the answer to that. So any type of transport can be handled by the tooling, and of course those cross-system dependencies can be mapped as well. So we're going to understand the sequencing and dependencies within a landscape, but then the dependencies across the different landscapes. Where if I might have a change, like you say, which like in an S4 environment, it might have some native HANA database changes. It might have some back-end ABAP changes, and it might have some Fiori changes, and they may have to be deployed across those different landscapes, in the correct sequence and things. And that's exactly what the tooling is there to help automate. So the answer to that is yes. Another interesting question here. How can we have multiple teams focused around business outcomes when we, let's say, only got 3 or 4 people in our basis team? We don't have enough people. That's an interesting question, but it's also one that is just because I, as a basis resource, am allocated to a team that's focused on a certain set of business outcomes, as we said. That doesn't mean to say that I can't belong to more than one of those teams. Yeah? So it's not as if we have to have a whole set of people purely dedicated to that set of business outcomes. It might be that that a number of our resources are actually allocated to more than one of those teams. But while they're when they're working as part of those teams, they are the ones that are part of that team, and they need to be focused on the business outcomes that that team is focused on. And one, I think, which is I suppose related to that in some ways, which is can these processes really be done at scale? Yeah, it's in some ways it's easy to start small, and it's quite difficult sometimes to actually scale some of these. But of course, we do have, sort of scaled agile framework and things like that, which will help us scale it out. And just for some context with this particular question, one of our customers, actually has 50 different Scrum teams, and they are able to automate and coordinate between those teams as well. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is possible to scale these types of things. Very quick one here. How do your tools handle QA system copybacks, or do they? And the answer to that is our tooling doesn't, but we can integrate with tooling which will help with and automate those sort of QA copybacks and bringing up systems and trying to automate and orchestrate those types of processes as well. I think that's it. That's about all we have time for. If there are any questions which I haven't answered, and there are a few, we will get back to you in the next few days with answers to those. So all that's left is to say thank you once again for attending. I shall bid you farewell, but don't forget, as I said, if you want to explore this subject any further, feel free to go onto our website and browse some of the resources available. But that's it from me. Thanks very much for your time today.